Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zupko. In the last 2 years, we have been hearing a lot about wars and conflicts, how states significantly reduce or even stop their diplomatic channels. We hear phrases such as, "we don't negotiate with terrorists," and still we see Israel and Hamas negotiating about the hostages. Or, on the other side, we also hear it's almost impossible to speak with Vladimir Putin, or we don't speak with Russia, and still we see the Russian LNG energy import in European Union. So in some way those channels must be open and people are speaking. And therefore our topic today is the European diplomacy in these bad times, in war times, in conflict times. And to do so, to explain a few important aspects of diplomacy, I invited my distinguished guest today, Professor Iver Neumann. Hello, Iver.
Hi there. How are you?
Not bad, thanks. Professor Neumann is a Norwegian political scientist and social anthropologist. He is director of the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Lysaker, Oslo. From 2012 to 2017, he was the Montague Burton Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He has also served as a research director and director at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and adjunct professor in international relations at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Iver is known for his research in diplomacy, in how polities relate to each other. He's speaking about the history, he's speaking about how we imagine the world, how the world works in principles, and also he's implementing some aspect of archaeology in his recent publications. So let's start with the first question. And rather than to answer some simple question, I would like to set up a ground for some explanations. And the question is, in what ways has the EU support for Ukraine been impacted by the parallel crisis in Israel and Gaza? And let's discuss particularly that sort of resource allocation and diplomatic focus of the European diplomacy at that setup.
Let's break this down and start with EU diplomacy as such, because it's an interesting thing that the EU has something approaching a diplomatic corps at all, the European External Action Service. When it was set up more than 10 years ago, it was Britain that objected to it being called a diplomatic service, but it has evolved in such a way that it partly is. Some stuff has been done by the Commission, but the European External Action Service is also rather important. But they don't send ambassadors. That title is reserved for representatives of states. And of course, it is a second-tier, should we say, phenomenon that you have EU diplomats working, should we say, parallel to and often in tandem to national diplomats. So in order to get a full feel for diplomacy in Europe, we have to look not only at the European External Action Service, we have to look at all of what the EU is doing diplomatically, and we also have to add what neighboring countries are doing diplomatically. And of course, in this case with Ukraine, we have a situation where diplomats from former Soviet states and partly also from former states dominated by the Soviet Union have been very much more active than have other EU states. And we also have a peculiarity when it comes to the situation in Gaza, because for obvious historical reasons, Germany is very reticent towards criticizing the state of Israel, to the extent that they have come very close to, if they haven't, curbed the right of expression for some of their own citizens of Palestinian background or with Palestinian sympathies. So we have all these cadences inside Europe to take care of. Now, your question, how the situation in Ukraine has been impacted by the situation in the Middle East, we could say generally, goes, of course, to the core of the situation today. I would say that the most important factor here is that it has made for a sharing of energy between the two places. It's always harder for an apparatus, for a bureaucratic apparatus, be that a diplomatic one or other apparatuses, to handle two things concurrently. I should also note that for most of the period since Russia attacked Ukraine, we have also had a crisis in the Sudan, but that has hardly been given much attendance at all. I see that some people think of this as an ethnocentric, Eurocentric, racist thing. I understand why they say that, but on the other hand, Ukraine is at Europe's doorstep. And it's a law of politics that what happens close to you takes more attendance than what happens further away. Interest in strangers is very much newer than interests in immediate neighbors. So I am not really surprised by this. The second, in addition to taking sort of resources away from Ukraine because they have to be divided, I think an important case here is that Europe's ally, the US, has been, I wouldn't say distracted, but has been very much involved in the Middle Eastern conflict, surprisingly much so on the Israeli side. I would have expected a generation that lived with the Vietnam War, which is Biden's generation, and also the generation after, which remembered the aftermath of the Vietnam War, to have understood young voices in the US who are critical of Israel much more. But to me, it's an interesting fact that one of the very few policy areas in the US where you have bipartisan alignment is over Israel, which is exactly, in my view, a case where one should have been much more critical towards Israel, and where Democrats should have lived up to the name of their party and supported international law and freedom of expression and freedom of congregation and all the other freedoms that we are used to thinking of as specific to democracy in Israel. But all this has distracted from the US's interest in Ukraine and has led to Europe being left as politically as a driving force in Ukraine. I am not saying this to occlude the fact that the US is actually transmitting more resources to the Ukraine war than is Europe. But in terms of attention, political attention, Europe is definitely in the lead and will have to remain so. We could also add, in addition to Sudan, that everything the US does when it comes to Ukraine is not only about signaling to Russia, it's also about signaling to China what will happen if China tries to take Taiwan. So as always in international, not at all as always, but as usual in international politics, we have a situation of so-called linkage, where one issue and how it is handled is being being influenced by what is happening in other theaters at the same time.
During your research and studying and publishing, you experienced the development of the European Union diplomacy. And there is a question from some students if the capabilities of the European diplomacy is stronger or greater, or is it stable during the years? And this comes from the ability to be sort of geopolitical actor in global arena. Mm-hmm. So how would you evaluate, let's say, 10, maybe 15 years of the European diplomacy based on your research?
So maybe one way to ease into the question is to go a bit further back to the Messina Conference, one of the very early efforts at European integration. And in Messina, the British observer wrote back to London that this meeting probably won't happen. And if it happens, it probably won't be able to agree on anything. And if, nonetheless, they should be able to agree on anything, it won't be implemented. So this whole sort of expectation that everything will come to nothing it will all come to naught. It will all sort of run into the sand, and there will be nothing happening. Skepticism, skepticism, skepticism. But what we've seen from the late 40s to today is more and more and more cooperation amongst European states. European integration has also reached the area of foreign policy and even defense. And it's a slow process, and it's an uphill process, and it hangs very much on the German-Franco relation, which is not always an equally happy relation. There has been backsliding. For example, to my mind, it was a pity that Britain left the EU, because Britain, for a number of reasons, but one of the obvious ones is that Britain is one of the EU's two nuclear powers. And to miss Britain means to miss a lot of oomph in international politics because of the nuclear side of things, but also because British diplomats are traditionally very good indeed, and they have an operative and trained military force that can be used for this, that, and the other thing. But nonetheless, we see more and more cooperation in this. All right, so the European External Action Service was set up. It was not a full diplomatic corps, but still it's there. All right, it has not been able to dominate the European Commission in the way that it probably assumed that it would, but it's still important, etc. So I see a slow and uneven increase in the importance of cooperation in the foreign policy and defense area in Europe. And I think most people who've taken a close look at this in the research world would agree with that assessment.
There are also people who argue about divisions in European diplomacy and European foreign policy. And there are two levels. The first one is sort of internal competition between the European External Service and European Commission. Mm-hmm. And the second is division among states, that some states have different point of view, so they don't support the United European Union policy or a particular stance when we have some events or geopolitical issues. So how do you see that process or that matter of being divided in European Union diplomacy?
It's obviously correct that these two divisions exist, and there will be other divisions as well. And there was a reason why I started with this when you asked me for my assessment of European diplomacy in general. What we should keep in mind is that these kinds of cooperation problems will be present in all political systems. Look at the United States, for example, still the most important and powerful country in the world. The two parties can hardly cooperate on anything, and yet nobody says that they come to nothing and do not implement anything because of that. It still goes forward. Et pour si muove, right? So yes, there are clear divisions. France should like to lead because of their force de frappe, because of their nuclear capabilities, and because of their general view of France as the key center in European politics. Germany, for historical reasons, would be more reticent, but Germany has become a more, I wouldn't say belligerent country, but a more normal country over the last 30 years or so. So I see great potential here. There is always a long conversation about the chemistry between the two leaders of the country. And those things are, of course, important in the moment and to understand what will happen in a month or maybe in half a year. But if we want to understand the longue durée, the long sort of the long lines here, the constellations historically, we have to see that these things are going. It sounds a bit much to say that they are going better and better, but they actually are. There is clearly an increase in cooperation. I would also keep in mind the fact that certain countries tend to shirk responsibility or even to go against the policy as such. I mean, the last couple of years, Hungary has been a typical example. You will have Orban being having the presidency and using that to mark certain foreign policy as sort of the mark the EU's policy as Hungary's policy. That is not being allowed to happen. And Hungary is an extreme case. I think Hungary is building to a showdown with the EU. The EU has signaled again and again and again and again that they can't really have that, but it still goes on. When I compare what Hungary is doing to what's happening in your country, in Slovakia, and particularly in Poland, I see a very clear difference where Hungary is much further sort of into a process of doubling down as an illiberal democracy. What I see in Poland and Slovakia would be a fight about where the country is going. What I see in Hungary is an ingrained authoritarianism that is growing worse. So, of course, this is a big problem, but in other political systems as well, you will have certain parts of states or certain parties inside the state that are making for problems. So we shouldn't overestimate the importance of this in the case of the EU. To take one example that I study a bit, the Russian bloggers, the so-called Russian military bloggers. You have a phalanx of really right-oriented people to the right of Putin, which is saying quite a lot. And despite the impossible problems of standing up to the Kremlin, they do. And of course, as seen from the Kremlin, they are way out of line. So here we have an example of that. In the US, we have the same kind of thing. We have vigilantes like the Proud Boys, who are at the margins or even outside the political system and making for problems. So in such a perspective, Hungary is not that big a deal for the EU.
Some people argue that the European External Action Service is lacking some competences. And some people are putting Joseph Borrell into sort of like speaker without any power or without any competencies to do something, to sign an agreement or to negotiate something. So how do you see the EU External Action Service regarding this sort of debate about competencies? Because when you go to the website of the European External Action Service, you can find excellent articles and really good reports about how the EU diplomacy is going, and you can find even the personal blog of Joseph Borrell, where he explains his stances and what he wants to do.
Well, maybe the European External Action Service should be thought of more as a decision shaper than a decision maker, because the Commission is, of course, on a general footing when it comes to politics in the EU, and it's very hard to waylay an ingrained player like the Commission. So the problem you point at is definitely real. But on the other hand, I think the European External Action Service has made a difference over the years, which is important. Let us not forget that the European External Action Service was set up as a hybrid. It was distinctly not a diplomatic service. It's, for example, they have open landscapes, and the feel of the building, the feel of the organization is a bit corporate. That is not the case with diplomatic corps. So I think they're an important part of the European Union structure. But you're right that federalists, and I think of myself as a federalist, would have liked to see them being stronger. But that is a question of politics, and that could change. But absolutely, you're right. They are not necessarily the number one force the way it should have been, but they are very central indeed. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that we can count with sort of strengthening the European External Action Service in the future? Is there sort of political will to do so based on your research? Or it's a vicious circle of discussion between people who are pro and people who are against, and people who are afraid of losing national sovereignty, national foreign policies? So how do you see this discussion?
I think you're definitely right that this is a question of sovereignty, and I think the key thing here would be the rise of populism in Europe. It's if we look at the phenomenon of diplomacy generally, the very basic idea of diplomacy, the foundation is that it is fine to speak to other people with a view to finding solutions. And those solutions should be solutions that where both parties could gain. And I just read an interview with John Bolton, who was he's been a sort of Republican politician for the foreign policy side in the US since the days of Reagan. He was also working for Trump. And he said something very interesting. He said, the Trump he came to know so well was someone who didn't quite understand what cooperation was. And that means that he thinks in terms of winners and losers all the time. Well, most of us think about winners and losers, but we also think about how we can make deals that make both parties sort of get on with one another and, in a better way than they were before. And this whole idea that if you only think about what's in it for me, you have a problem with diplomacy. So this is the basic thing. A corollary of that is that in order to work diplomatically, you have to think a bit forward. For illustration, maybe those of us who are married will grasp this point better than those of us who are not. If your partner asks you whether you want to go to a concert and you really don't want to go, you may say yes because you want to go to a concert or do something else further on down the line. And if you say yes this time, maybe you will have a chance to see the REM or whatever you want to see the next time. There's a tit for tat here. It's that there is a Buggins turn. You'll give in on this and I will give in on something else. For example, when you asked about Ukraine and Gaza, you can be damn sure that European countries are sitting around and negotiating in this way, saying that, okay, so if we give a package to Ukraine, this, that, and big, I really don't want to give that little, but I will agree with that if we can give more to Israel or the other way around, this linkage politics. And this is of the essence for diplomacy to work. But populists don't really think about diplomacy that way. They think about it as a one-off, what can I get this time? They are transactional, to use an American word. So, for example, every time there's a deal to be made, they think, what can I get out of this deal? Who's the winner? Who's the loser? And how can I maximize this deal? Instead of thinking, life goes on. Maybe if I abstain from taking that tiny little advantage, maybe I can sort of get that fivefold back the next time. In my view, this is the mark of a mature human being. Populists don't think that way. They think, let's grab it while we can. And that's bad news for diplomacy, because it means that diplomacy has to start anew every time. So if you have a bilateral relationship between Slovakia and Czechia, for example, every time you start, you should think, let's maximize that. But the world isn't like that. There are so many things going on at the same time, and you can be very certain that there will be new things happening later. So diplomacy is about building a relationship, give and take, in order to win in the long run. And this demands an understanding of politics, which is rather different from what we find amongst populist parties today. So this is the number one challenge to not only to European diplomacy, EU diplomacy, but to diplomacy in general these days, I think.
You mentioned populists and we mentioned European Union leaders and institutions, but there is one important element that I consider as very crucial in European diplomacy, and that's the public opinion and support. Because you must have support when you go outside or when you receive a guest from abroad and you negotiate. How do you see the public opinion, and how do you think is the development of the support for European diplomacy in this area?
I agree with you that this is super important, because and it is a dilemma for any diplomat, because diplomats are supposed to represent the country, And if you have big groups in that country that do not feel represented by the diplomats, we have a problem. And as you mentioned, I'm a Norwegian myself, or to use the EEO lingo, Norway is the country I know best. And both in 1972 and in 1994, Norway wanted to become, or the Norwegian state applied for EU membership. We have then had negotiations, and there was a referendum whether on the strength of those negotiations we should become a member of the EU, and the answer was no both times. So the diplomats negotiated to the best of their ability, and we had a deal, but that deal was rejected by public opinion. And of course, it can't get more important than that a diplomatic deal is scuppered because of your own population. And of course, this is not good for diplomatic work at all, because it means that you have acted in a way where you aren't thought of as a proper representative of your group, which means you can't really be a fully fledged diplomatic force. So I totally agree with you. Let me give you another example. British politicians, and in a certain degree other politicians in the EU, made a sort of virtue of not only a necessity and not only a habit, but a virtue of coming home from Brussels and saying, we really wanted to do this, that, and the other, but the EU shot us down. Now, if that is what you say to your population again and again and again and again, people, of course, start to believe it, that, oh, our politicians could really have done so much more if it hadn't been for the EU. Whereas the actual sort of truth of the matter is that countries go in, try to get the best deals. Okay, so you win some days, you lose some days, you get a lot one day, you get less another day, and you go back and you say, oh, we fought for our positions, and here is what we get. So Brexit is a lot to do with politicians simply not being responsible and taking the consequence of their own work within the EU. And this should be a lesson for diplomats from other countries, be that Slovakia or any other country, that you don't always blame Brussels. You say how things were, how things went. And so there will be times when you feel that when a country in the EU feels that it has really compromised a lot. And there is nothing wrong with politicians saying that, but if they're saying it all the time, they're simply blowing political support to smithereens. This is not conducive to a good European integration process.
And I also think that there is not much room in media for diplomats to express opinions. For instance, when I go through the newspapers of European Union, there is, for instance, Le Monde, and they have a special magazine called Le Monde Diplomatique. And this is quite nice because you can read about diplomacy, you can read about international relations from slightly different perspectives than only from politicians. How do you see the room for diplomacy, for practitioners of diplomacy to express opinion or their views in media? Because this is the aspect I came across when I was teaching my students in Scotland, and we were speaking about diplomacy, and they asked, but where can I find an interview with the ambassador, or where can I find what is the EU diplomat in Indonesia thinks about Indonesian internal politics? And we then went to Google and we were trying to put some keywords, and it was not as easy as we thought.
And the reason for that is very simple. A diplomat is a representative of his or her country. So what they call their personal opinions should not shadow for their opinions of their states. The problem here is that diplomats were used to being the only representatives of a state's opinion. And of course, with democratization and with the technological advance that was first TV and then social media, you have a lot of people from a country tussling for defining what the view of a state is. And you would have expected diplomats to throw themselves into that fray and try to define their state's policy. But most diplomats have taken a step back and said, let's just repeat the state's position. And to do that, they have not told every diplomat they have in their corps that they can speak that opinion. They have developed and evolved rather large secretariats and press offices that should take care of this. So that's one thing. The other thing is that you have different traditions here. Revolutionary US and revolutionary Russia developed policies where diplomats would also speak on their own behalf. And to this day, you can see that off and on, so you will find in the newspapers articles written by Russian and American diplomats, ambassadors to a certain country. They will participate in the local debate. Another country that will do this would be Israel, where the Israeli ambassador is quite often seen to reply to what he or she would see as attacks on his country. So there are different diplomatic styles here, and the European style has been to be reticent about all this. That may change. I see a clear change. To take the country I know best again, Norway. In the interwar period, diplomats weren't even allowed to write book reviews in newspapers and magazines because that was thought of as compromising for that country's foreign policy. Now that kind of thing would be no problem, and diplomats are usually given a lot of presentations for different this, that, and the other, but they don't write in newspapers that much. This is still the case, yes. And there are pros and cons to that. I'm amongst those who think that diplomats should participate more in the debate, because that would be yet another way that the state would get its views across.
I also agree with your opinion or your stance, because I think it's a sort of double sword. On one hand, it's expressing of opinion about particular issue. On the other hand, it's a kind of soft power that countries can use to influence the public opinion and to influence the bilateral or multilateral relations. Because if ambassador has an interview with a good journal or good magazine, people read it, and they know that the journalist has sort of reputation, so the questions are good, and the answer must follow those questions. So that would be my remark.
I agree. And that would also, it would go both ways. It would also cut the way, its way into domestic politics. If you have a country's ambassadors explaining, of course, in a non-partisan way, what is going on, that could help the level of information in that country about what's going on abroad. And in an era of globalization, this is super important. Everybody talks about globalization being rolled back. But even if globalization is being rolled back a bit, we are still very, very much more interdependent than we have ever been before. And we will probably continue to be so. So knowledge about the rest of the world is super important. It's important politically, economically, philosophically, morally, you name it.
Let's speak a little bit about the impact and influence of European diplomacy, Iver. We already mentioned Ukraine and we mentioned Israel. And there is a question, the capabilities of European diplomacy as we have at the moment. Is European Union diplomacy losing in the Middle East, or how is it?
Is anyone winning in the Middle East? I can see Russia having a position through their Syrian stance. I can see China using its economic influence to settle themselves in the region, and I can see them trying to work as a negotiator between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which are the two key states here, as a vector. And I can see the US despairing that Israel is their only sort of strong ally, not their only ally, but their only strong ally in the Middle East, and that the price of supporting Israel is going up, 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 up. So everybody has problems in the Middle East. The two European countries that, for obvious colonial reasons, used to be the strong ones in the Middle East would be Britain and France. They are struggling. So everybody's struggling in the Middle East, and Europe, as the EU, is no exception. So yes, we're all struggling.
The next question is connected to the Middle East, and that comes from the international law. And also I discussed this with some scholars, and that's the recognition of the Palestinian state.
It's very hard indeed. But again, it's not new. A very good example in the literature would be the recognition of Francoist Spain at the end of the 1930s. How should one recognize? What should one recognize? What should that recognition entail, etc.? So the whole question of when and how to recognize states is a fraught one. I have no answer for you. I think there must be a consensus inside the EU before an EU policy can be sort of hammered out, and before that there will be the national policies that will work. And I will foresee that Germany will be an interesting sort of player here, because we already touched on that. For very specific reasons, Germany has enormous problems with critiquing Israel. To me, it's a bit of a paradox that Germany is so afraid of doing something because it was involved in a genocide, and by doing nothing and not criticizing Israel, it may be involved in a new genocide by simply having been a bystander while the Palestinians are being wiped out in Gaza. So the German policy may backfire, but that is neither here nor there. I can't answer your question.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, and also I think it's difficult in terms how to design the national foreign policy versus the European foreign policy, because in some way you will be facing this question. So yeah, I think it's a difficult one. The last question for this part about European diplomacy and geopolitics comes from criticism that European diplomacy is not strong enough. And this comes also most from non-European countries. For instance, India, China, sometimes even Japan, that they are struggling to see why the European diplomacy is doing that or this. How to approach this criticism from non-EU countries?
That is a general problem for diplomats all over. And it's a dilemma. What you do with allies is that you try to coordinate beforehand, and if you can't agree, then you at least inform your allies beforehand. Under George W. Bush, for example, the problem for Europe was that the US didn't really inform their European allies about what they're about to do. They just simply sort of gratuitously left them out of the loop, which was very bad for alliance policies. So the EU, Europe didn't abandon the US, but they started liking the US only with their heads and not as before with their hearts, which is a huge loss in human relations. You want people to like you not only with the head, but also with the heart. It has enormous advantages. So that was simply bad diplomacy on the US's side. What you do as a diplomat is that you are going around trying to anchor your policy as much as possible before you actually implement it. In this case, diplomacy is rather similar to politics in general. There are a number of ways in which diplomacy diverges from other kinds of politics, but in this case, it's the same. You just see to it that you talk to people, try to get them on board, and if you don't get them on board, at least you see to it that you minimize the fallout of the disagreements. And that's how you do it. That is a very important part of diplomatic work indeed.
In the next part of this interview, we'll go through diplomacy from the perspectives of the international relations theories. There is a common question coming from students, especially when you teach international students. Some of them, they understand diplomacy as a practice. Some of them, they understand diplomacy as a foreign policy. How to approach this? What would be your recommendation as a professor, as a person who published so many articles and books to this question?
In my view, this is a rather simple thing. Foreign policy would be everything that the state does and coordinates towards other states and organizations, and sometimes also towards other entities. But it's the full gamut of what the state is doing that relates to the rest of the world. So, for example, you will have relations between the traffic committees in Slovakia and Czechia. They will be busy talking about how to keep roads open, how to open new ways, how to see to it that there will be different this, that, and the other. Very, very mundane stuff. It would still be part of foreign policy. Right? There will be a lot of stuff going on between states that the foreign ministries don't even know about. Once they know about it and do something about it, or once another ministry they know about it or do something about it, that will be foreign policy. When politicians who are not foreign ministers or ministers of defense go abroad, that's definitely foreign policy. Is it necessarily diplomacy? No. Diplomacy is a specific way of dealing with where representatives of states, usually from the foreign ministry or with the involvement of the foreign ministry, deal with other entities, which is a narrower thing. And diplomacy has a specific set of rules that would also not necessarily be followed in foreign policy. For example, that you will report to the other foreign ministry that you're working with, you will set up meetings, etc. So that would be the broad answer. There will also be a very specific epistemological answer, and an answer in terms of knowledge production, which is that within the study of international relations, foreign policy analysis and diplomatic studies are two rather different things. There are two different literatures that concentrate on different things. Foreign policy analysis will go for specific questions about who did what, how, with what results, whereas diplomatic studies sometimes looks at that, but also we'll look at how the whole thing came to be what it is. It's more historically and genealogically oriented. So there's also that epistemological difference to take care of. Mm-hmm.
Let's go through some theories. I don't have a specific question for you either, but maybe you can explain how you see the international relations theories and diplomacy. What sort of impact is there? Maybe you can give us some examples from your practice and research. And I think that will be quite beneficial for all of us.
Well, let's start with how this evolved. People who've been writing on diplomacy have been diplomats themselves. So they have been people working in the field who have either written about diplomacy for a general audience, or they have written manuals for other diplomats. So a typical example would be Sato's Guide to Diplomatic Practice, which has come in 7 different editions over the last 103 years. It's quite impressive, really. Whereas there's a lot about what diplomats should do, as it were. So it's a book of recipes. If this had been cooking, it would have been a cook's book, right? The master of this trade would be, again, a Brit called Sir Harold Nicholson, who wrote a number of small books about the nature of diplomacy, where he talked in straightforward terms about how diplomacy has evolved historically and what kind of rules that kept that game together. So it was only in the late 80s where scholars who were not themselves diplomats started to look at diplomacy. And the first author I would like to highlight would be an American with an Armenian name, James Derderian, who wrote a book simply called On Diplomacy, in the old Latin style, all books were called On This, On That, De Cive, etc. And that is a genealogy of how diplomatic practice evolved, where he started with the philosophical Hegelian idea that diplomacy is the mediation of estrangement. So not only how to deal with the other, but how to deal with the estranged other, other humans who are not part of your group, as it were. And that's proved pretty beneficial. And then since then, there has been an explosion in diplomatic studies. 35 years has produced quite a lot of a body of work. For example, you have Bourdieusian work starting from the French sociologist and anthropologist Pierre Bourdieu, where we look at things like the habitus of diplomats. How diplomats sort of how they function in the world, as it were. What does the diplomats' world look like, and what effects does that have on the rest of the world? That's been quite beneficial. You even have some Neumannian studies of diplomacy, where the point is to demonstrate how diplomacy has evolved as a function of, as a result of overall changes in international politics. So what the field of diplomatic study has done, I think, can be summed up in two ways. One way is simply to document diplomatic practices so that we now know much more about what's happening and what has happened in diplomacy. If you ask a question like, when did diplomats start doing planning, and when was planning institutionalized as a diplomatic practice, you can go to the literature and you can have an answer. When I started in the late 80s, you couldn't, because articles and books like that simply went there. And the other thing is that diplomacy has been theorized as social practice, as something that has a social form, and why it has that social form. For example, why is it so important to not to take a sort of diplomatic basic thing? Don't antagonize your opposite number unnecessarily. The important word here is unnecessarily. Diplomats antagonize themselves all the time, but they do it to get effects that will be good for them. But to antagonize another diplomat, a fellow diplomat, without having any reason to do so is simply bad diplomacy. There is only one country in the world that does that as a matter of course, and that would be Israel, because they think that they seem to think, and the diplomats included, that striking first is much more efficient than waiting to be struck. And if you ask me, the results for Israel has been of that way of thinking has been appalling, and it's not a particularly good idea. And it's also interesting that of the almost 200 diplomatic calls that we have in this world, Israel is the only one that operates like that. The other ones are a bit reticent, right? So that's important. Diplomacy has also been, the diplomatic studies has also been very interested in demonstrating some things that you sort of talked about at the very beginning of this interview. For example, how can it be that you can have war and diplomacy at the same time? Many people think that when people break off the diplomatic relations they have with one another, that's the end of the relationship. That isn't so. What happens is that this is an official gesture, and when a state breaks relations with another state, they go to a third party, a third state, and they say, could you help us with our relations with this state? So that third state opens a desk inside its embassy and takes care of that other state's. So for give you a concrete example, for many years, it's at an end now, but for many years, the US didn't have diplomatic relations with Cuba. Does that mean that there was no contact at the highest level between the US and Cuba? Of course not. What it meant was that the US had gone to Switzerland and said, we're not going to have an official representation in this country anymore. Would you mind taking care of it for us? And so the Swiss did. So every time there was a meeting of diplomats at the Cuban Foreign Ministry, for example, there would be a depeche sent from the Swiss embassy back to Washington telling them about what was going on. The same thing when you have war. War is not the opposite of diplomacy. There is diplomacy before war, there is diplomacy during wars, and there's diplomacy after the war. And during war, you will, of course, have these back channels that could be set up beforehand or ad hoc, where stuff is going on. So you sometimes hear diplomats saying it's hard to talk to that and that state. You mentioned the example now of Europe and Putin, which is true. Does that mean that there is no contact? Of course not. There are always contacts. And this is where it's getting interesting, because those contacts can involve very unlikely people. You use what is there, right, to get the job done. So this is the way diplomacy can suddenly envelop people who have never done anything diplomatic before, but suddenly finds themselves in a place where the state can use them for this. And historically, this used to be traders and missionaries. So again, we are on sort of solid historical ground here.
Absolutely. And Iver, what's your opinion about having, let's say, three major paradigms in international relations, realist, liberals, and constructivist? What's the influence on diplomacy from those people or those scholars?
This is an extremely nice heuristic device, as we say, as a device to help us learn and help us remember for students, because in order to start getting what the different opinions are, you have categories to say, oh, she's a liberal, she's a realist, he's a post-structuralist, etc. So it's a very nice way of doing that. Now, the problem is that once you've learned this, you start seeing that most people who have a mind will use it independently. So almost by definition, I mean, if you just if your mouth opens and what comes out is a straight realist line or a straight liberal line, it means that those words haven't really sort of passed through your head and had a sifting there. It's simply the discourse coming straight out of your mouth. It's not your opinion, right? When you start looking at thinkers, they sometimes fall into these categories, usually when they've made them themselves. For example, John Mearsheimer is an offensive realist, well, in both kinds of meanings of that word, I think. And of course he developed that category himself in order to suit himself. But once you start looking at other people who have similar sort of meanings, you see that, oh, what she said there is a bit liberal, would that really sort of, I don't know. So at some point, you have to sort of ease up a little for those categories. I mean, these are not pigeonholes at the post office. These are heuristic devices. But having said that, I think it's very nice that we have them, because there are certain basic differences in thinking about international relations. For example, I mentioned one when we talked about populists. To use the game theory language, is diplomacy a one-off game or is it an iterative game? If diplomacy is a one-off game, you can bully your opponent all you like because you won't lose anything doing that. But if you think that diplomacy and life as such is an iterative game, you want to build relations. So these kinds of things actually mean something.
And how do you see if some people, they study different international relations theories, for instance, Chinese tradition or some thoughts coming from the Islamic world that we had in the past? So they always think that diplomacy is sort of Western-centric thing. So how do you see this European-centric diplomacy as a myth, or is it sort of reality?
No, there's definitely something there. But if you look at work on early diplomacy, you see that all known groups have it, for the simple reason that all known groups will have to relate to other groups. And they will have ways of doing that. And once they've had a relationship over time, they will usually evolve certain ways of handling that relationship. It will be institutionalized. So, for example, you would have, before contact was made between Australia and the rest of the world, in the late 1700s, you would have Aboriginal groups having clear rules about how to conduct diplomacy. For example, you would have a messenger stick. A lot of of peoples at a technically primitive level would have that. You would have specific rules for how you can cross a tribe's territory in order to get red sand that was used for religious practices, etc. So diplomacy, what we now call diplomacy, is of course, a shibboleth for a number of practices that are deeply ingrained in human history. So, in that sense, there is nothing Eurocentric about it. Now, while the reason why I said that there is still something there is that it's quite obvious that as Western colonialism hit its stride from the 1500s onwards, and particularly since 1750, Europeans' ways of doing things would, of course, be backed by more military power, and so they would be sort of sticking more. I'll give you an example. The early contacts between Europeans and Native Americans would involve diplomacy where you exchanged so-called wampum, that would be sort of pearls on strings, and Europeans would accommodate to these practices because that was the way things were done there. As Europeans grew stronger, one started writing treaties, which was the European way of doing things. So one went from a non-writing culture to a writing culture, right? So obviously, since Europe had the upper hand in terms of power, they were also more influential in institutionalizing diplomacy. That's not the whole story, though, because when you look at consular diplomacy, for example, you see that Middle Eastern practices from around the Mediterranean were super important. Then you have the changes in practices that have followed decolonization that demonstrate that this is a rather pliable business. So you also have the fact that things are becoming so much closer. And you if you have debates, they're rather stylized. For example, there was a tiff when Iranians came to first France and then Italy, where the wine should be served. One country decided to serve wine, the other one decided not to serve wine. But if that's what it comes down to, these are important things symbolically, but in terms of getting conversations going, they are small things. It's like Soviets insisted that they should never use black tie, right? They only came in suits. All right, big deal. I mean, we've been able to institutionalize diplomacy pretty well, even though it is, of course, it has a Eurocentric side. I wrote an article about this for the European Journal of International Relations, which, if memory serves, was called Eurocentric Diplomacy, challenging but manageable, or something like that. And that's still my position on this. This is stuff that we can handle.
And Iver, do we have any diplomatic schools that are famous in the world?
Well, if you look at which countries that actually offer diplomatic training, and there are quite a lot of diplomatic training institutes and outfits around the globe, it's quite often the the English-speaking world. It used to be the French-speaking world, which is, of course, because French used to be the lingua franca of diplomacy, and for the last couple of or at least since the First World War, it's been English. So language comes into it in a big way. Then, of course, you have styles like the Chinese will be more. I mean, the difference that anthropologists are fond of is what they call high context and low context cultures. High context means that you will have a lot of stash and a lot of ritual and a lot of specific clothing, food, etc., in order to ease into the conversation. So you can't just come up and say, "Hi there, should we speak diplomacy?" You have to go through pretty lengthy stuff in order to get going. Whereas so China would be like that. On the other hand, you have the US, where you sort of somehow can just send an email and say, "Hello, should we have a meeting?" And you expect an answer. So the high context, low context thing is important. But except for that, nah.
Or what's the typical characteristics of Norwegian diplomacy?
Well, there was number 2 at the British Embassy some years ago was asked that question, and she said, "Well, if you ask a Norwegian, what's your secret agenda, he will tell you. It's not really that bad, but Scandinavians like to have things out in the open. We like to get to the point. We are pretty low context in that way. And there is a certain honest John quality to Norwegian diplomats. That does not mean that Norwegian diplomats are naive. It simply means that we are bona fide. We expect conversations to be held in order to get somewhere. Norwegian diplomats don't like to sit around waiting for stuff to happen. They like to get into the spirit of the thing and get their hands dirty and get the job done. I think that's so sort of goal oriented. I think would be the word I will use for Norwegian diplomats.
Iver, thank you very much for your insightful thoughts and that you shared many examples and your experience with us. I think this episode is very important, especially in these times when people are slightly struggling with diplomacy, and diplomacy is put a little bit behind, bit in the background. But as we said, diplomacy works. There are open channels between the countries and people are speaking. And I hope that we find new dimensions of diplomacy. I hope that this encourages students, junior researchers and scholars to research diplomacy, because it's a fascinating subject. And just when people go to your Google Scholar, they can see how many articles they can write about diplomacy and how many perspectives they can find about diplomacy as well. So Iver, again, thank you very much for being on IR Think.